So without further ado, I'm very excited today to welcome Ari Richter, celebrating the release of Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz, a graphic family memoir of trauma and inheritance. Ari Richter is a visual artist and professor at the City University of New York. His drawings, sculptures, videos, performances, and lectures have been presented in museums, galleries, and academic spaces throughout the U.S. Richter is the recipient of fellowships from the Mellon Foundation and the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. He is the son of therapists and the grandson of Holocaust survivors. Told from the perspectives of 4 generations of the author's family, Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz is both a celebration of Jewish cultural resilience and a warning of democracy's fragility in the face of the seductive forces of authoritarianism. Part travelogue, part memoir, and part historic retelling, Richter recreates his family's journey leading up to and extending beyond the Holocaust. Harrowing and humorous in equal measure, this evocatively drawn graphic novel will be discussed for generations to come. Richter will be joined in conversation with Sarah Wildman. Sarah Wildman is an opinion editor at the New York Times. She has been a regular contributor to the New York Times, Slate, and the New Yorker Online, and she's also the author of Paper Love, Searching for the Girl My Grandfather Left Behind. Please join me in welcoming Ari Richter and Sarah Wildman.
Hello.
So nice that it's a really light news day for Washington and just super casual, nothing happening. I mean,
very
nobody
light
else.
cycle.
Yeah, it's good. I was just saying that the only good news was that it didn't break while we were sitting here to have everyone's news.
It would have been very rude if we were just on our phones, like, hold on, just wait.
Exactly. Us too. So this is a very exciting book for me because it's the kind of book I want to read, I think, 3 times because it's so layered. It's a Russian doll of a book. It's a memoir, and it is a family narrative, and it's also modern, and it's the past, which is something that's really difficult to pull off, and Ari very much does it. But he does it in a manner that's very different from my medium, which is as a graphic novel. And I wanted to start with that. And obviously, you're an artist, but why a graphic novel? I mean, not novel, sorry, graphic memoir.
Graphic memoir, yes. I do make that distinction a lot because, graphic novels are a marketing term and, it's helpful in that context. But, what I wrote is nonfiction. And I think especially when you're talking about the Holocaust and that legacy, it's important to understand and to make that very clear that this is, a work of nonfiction, that this is a memoir. But the why the graphic novel part of it, the graphic memoir part of it, and not another form of visual art, is just simply the directness of the medium. I think that graphic narrative has a unique way of telling a story twice. It tells a story both visually and in the literary sense as well. And between those two tellings, there is so much potential for the information to be both understood in a direct way, but also to be expanded upon and to have the kind of the imagination of the viewer, the reader, present there as well. So, when thinking about this topic, I've never before writing this book been a graphic artist. I've always been a fine arts context kind of artist, and I knew I needed to be more direct with the telling of this. I couldn't have so much abstraction in the process as I maybe would have in fine art work, that it kind of gets muddled in that translation. It had to be direct. It had to be kind of like very accessible to the reader, and that's where I landed on this part. But otherwise, as you'll see in the book, I come from a background of being a comics obsessed kid, so I definitely have that in my DNA, coming into this.
I think that's part of the reason why it's the kind of book you want to read several times, because you're reading the text, you're also engaging with the art, and you sort of want to go back again and again to each of those parts and see what you miss on the first reading. I want to go into a little bit. We're both 3rd generation after the Holocaust, but the book doesn't actually begin necessarily with the Holocaust. It really begins with an assimilationist background in red state in a red corner of a red state. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, so I am from Florida. I'm from Tampa, Florida. My parents, David and Regina Richter, sitting right in the front here, beaming at me, brought me up there. And, there is a small Jewish population there, small Jewish community. It definitely tends toward the conservative, as we've, not in like the, conservative Judaism versus Reform Judaism sense, but in the conservative politics, as we've certainly learned in recent years. Florida used to be a more purple state. It's become more of a red state. My mom's doing her darndest as a Democratic Party organizer to try to change that. But it's it is a very specific climate there, and growing up there, assimilation was definitely the norm. It's just the type of assimilation of Jewish people there was very much like the kind of like waspy, assimilation strain. So very sporty. I am not a very sporty guy. You might look at me and think otherwise, but I'm more of the Nebuchadnezzar type. When it wasn't really until I moved to New York that I kind of found my cultural mishpucha. But that is the Florida that I come from and still know.
Why don't you read to us a little bit about that origin story?
Let's do. So this is my first time doing a reading from the book. So let's see how this works from this perspective. So let's see. Advance. No, advance. Okay, so this is the title page. I just want to also show off these beautiful title pages made by the designer Dana Collins for Fantagraphics, which I think really embody something special about the book. But okay, so advance to the next slide. Okay. So starting in the second panel there, first panel are some of the, quote, undercover Jews that I encountered in college, other undercover Jews as myself who, are like, we're culturally something else. We're less Jewish and more, American. But so second panel there's me and my father. As embarrassed as I was to be publicly Jewish, I was privately obsessed with it. When we got the internet in the mid-90s, one of the first things I did was search the names of celebrities with the word Jewish, which is quite frankly something I still do very often. So here's, hey Dad, check out this website I found with a comprehensive list of famous Jews. Maybe I'll be on there one day. My dad goes at the computer, click, www.jewwatch.com. Ari, gulp, this website isn't what you think it is. And you'll see in that Venn diagram, if you can read it, my first introduction to this Venn diagram of obsession with Jewish power that overlaps Jews and anti-Semites. But I think it's a very real Venn diagram. Okay, moving on to the next page. My own encounters with anti-Semitism were often subtle, like the time I was pushed into fighting the only other Jewish kid at a fourth grade slumber party who already had a black belt in karate and, not a fair playing field. I did not have a black belt in karate. Other times they were more overt. Ach, shoot the inmate, he's trying to escape. Haha, look at that scrawny Jew, he looks like he's running for his life. Mostly, though, it was just out of cluelessness. Ari, you should come to my church sometime. I'm Jewish, right? It's fine. My pastor says that anyone can be saved. Oops. Wait. It didn't take long for me to begin recasting these experiences into my own brand of ironic anti-Semitism. Hey, Samara, my sister, have fun at concentration camp. If you can zoom in, it actually says conservation camp, and that is a true story. And my dad says, I know you were just teasing your sister, but I don't think your grandparents would find that joke very funny. My grandparents being Holocaust survivors. It was a way to prove that my Jewishness didn't define me the way everyone else tried to define me by it. I gotta go. Old man Noah just rode up in his old Jew canoe. Truth be told, I was afraid that if it wasn't me who cracked the joke, I'd still end up on the butt end. There's me in the locker room at school dancing with an athletic cup as a yarmulke to Fiddler on the Roof. But Jewish jokes amongst Jews are just more earned, a way to bond over shared trauma. Hey, Dad, you know why this elevator came for us? Because it's Schindler's Lift. And yes, it is that Schindler, and that was a joke I made as a child. Moving to New York in my mid-20s was the first time I felt truly connected to my Jewish sense of self. Jews were everywhere, with seemingly nothing to hide. It was here that I went from never having even dated a Jewish woman to marrying one. my lovely wife, Erin Carmone, sitting in the front row, who wrote a book about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who did officiate our wedding for extra Jew points. And together, we can make ironic jokes about shysters and domineering mothers and blood libel and global cabals. And looks like the Jews just brought another building on the block. Uh-oh, there goes the neighborhood, because it's our birthright. Reading number 1.
Thank you. All of those jokes aside, I think one of the things that you and I share is this sense of having been an accidental American, and that the origin story is as much underlying your thinking about identity as it is about the present. And so I know you have a second. Remind me where the second reading is. I just want to make sure we jump to it. Oh, right. So, but given all of that, you talk a lot in the beginning of the book about how most of this seems like the past until it doesn't. So why don't you give us a little bit of a sense now, again, in this reading, of the beginnings of why you start to dig back into the past, and then we'll really dig back in.
Okay, answer right there. The Tree of Life. This is the second chapter of the book. Okay, and the context is that we are having just a planned catch up with one of my wife Erin's at that time nonagenarian cousins who are themselves Holocaust survivors. This is just jumping in partially through the chapter. Our planned catch-up that October afternoon did not go as expected. The Tree of Life synagogue shooting had just happened that morning. There's Jake Tapper telling us about the events. We watched in a daze as the news unfolded. Eventually, Jacob, the 90-plus-year-old cousin, broke the silence. Why does this keep happening to the Jews? Maybe there's something wrong with us after all. We had no words to respond. Who were we to tell a Holocaust survivor not to blame himself? Ourselves. Oops. We said our goodbyes and spent a silent car ride home. My thoughts kept flashing to those ubiquitous donation plaques in the lobby of my own synagogue growing up, but cast in a new, irreversible hue. In an instant, my sense of security had been upended. I began connecting the dots through events that I'd previously shrugged off. It was like flipping on a light in a dark room, exposing something sinister that had been hiding there all along. I could finally see myself reflected, as I'd never dared to see myself before, as the other. With Gentiles portraying us as ugly stereotypes for centuries, how do we not internalize this worldview? A few little slides there. First one at the top is the popular medieval representation of the Judensau, of Jews suckling milk and excrement from a pig. The second one there, Nazi propaganda children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom. And third, the enduring character Shylock from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, played in Enduring Jew Face by Al Pacino. The operating assumption for American Jews has long been a simple one, that assimilation plus prosperity is a shield from oppression. Here's a pretend Mr. Model minority competition from 1965. I hope to set an example for all other immigrants in this great country so that they, too, may pull themselves up by their bone bootstraps and enjoy the full benefits and security of the American dream. But this whole paradigm is a miscalculation when anti-Semitism is an obsession with the very privilege and perceived influence meant to nullify oppression. And there is a assimilation plus affluence equals privilege, ? Privilege equals security, ? In the following days, I slipped into a depression. I began crying out of the blue, sometimes in public. I couldn't get any work done in the studio, although I did have some inspiration in the classroom. The more I looked for anti-Semitism in the world around me, the more examples I found. One day, in the studio, I began to search through some documents I had on hand. My grandfathers had both been amateur family historians, and they wrote about two very different German Jewish experiences: the cosmopolitan lives of Grandpa Karl and Grandma Ruth's families in Germany's urban centers of Stuttgart, Breslau, and Berlin, and the hardscrabble existence of Grandpa Jack's family in Germany's rural Southwest. And that is where I leave.
So throughout your childhood, it sounds like the stories of your grandparents played a role, but we think about trauma and our received inheritance of this type of story differently as we age. So there's something about this moment that makes you dig back in. What did you hear as a kid? What did you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think my grandparents and my family in general were very good at telling me some version of the story. You know, it's like my dad's parents, my dad's father was a rabbi, and his wife the wife of a rabbi, and they were very public people. So they spent a lot of their lives, giving talks and sermons and lectures about their experience escaping from Nazi Germany and what they left behind, what they lost, and so they were very out front about it. My mom's father, who was the survivor from rural southwestern Germany, it was a lot harder, I think, for him. I didn't know him earlier in his life, but later in his life, I think at more retirement age, my grandmother, who was an American-born Jew, sort of convinced him to start therapy, and that kind of process got him to be more open and engaged in talking about his experiences. But but it was always in the background. I mean, all my grandparents were avid readers, and they all had huge libraries of Holocaust literature and literature about the Jewish diaspora and that experience. So it was always in the background, and and it was all the specific information, the written testimonies and autobiographies, and these things were always there and on the shelf and accessible. It just was not until I was at this stage in my life that I was really ready to engage with them in a way where I could, try to inhabit the experiences.
When you were ready to engage, were any of them still living?
Unfortunately, no. Yeah, no. My grandparents all died in the early 2000s and the early 2010s. So, I kicked myself constantly throughout the course of making this book that I didn't ask them some of these questions that I wanted to or needed to ask them when they were alive. But, I wasn't ready. And that's, I think, the root of it was that, I could not have written this book in my youth, or I could not have even kind of like fathomed, that this is something that I would want to talk about. And, earlier in the chapter about growing up in Tampa, like I had a real drive toward that, white American assimilation myself. It's like I'm I'm an American by birth and a Jew by, accident of heritage, in a sense. So, for me, it just felt like something that I could, distance myself from by having that security of perceived security of the position that I was born into here.
What I think is really interesting, and as I mentioned at the beginning, that this is sort of a memoir within a memoir within a memoir. And so what then you then do is you dig back in. There's a fair amount of testimony that you do have. You can't ask questions of it, but it exists.
Right.
And you tell the stories of each of these grandparents. Do you want to briefly tell? There are several really evocative characters, and each of them have a remarkable story, because any story of survival during the war is remarkable, but each has their own arc.
Yeah. So, and I happen to have an amazing, a quantity of written testimony. I mean, just my written and also recorded interviews with my survivor grandparents. So I was very fortunate. I mean, most people, don't have access to that much information, but the basic layout of the characters as they are in the book. My father's parents, Rabbi Carl Richter and Ruth Richter, my grandmother. Carl was born in Stuttgart, which is kind of a cosmopolitan city, manufacturing city in Germany. His parents were from Bielsk-Biała in what was then Austria, now Poland, and he went to rabbinical school in Breslau, where he met my grandmother, who was the daughter of one of the trustees at the seminary in Breslau, which is now Wrocław, Poland, as well. And so he started as a congregational rabbi in Germany, and as Hitler was already ascended to power, and then they essentially escaped in 1939, really by the skin of their teeth, on a U.S. Non-quota visa, specifically for clergy. So they got out on a special non-quota visa, and they were able to get their parents out as well. Miraculously, both sets of their parents survived, but the rest of the family basically did not. And then my other grandfather, Jack Koenig, who's my mother's father, was born in Rhineland-Palatinate, which is rural southwestern Germany, small town of Alsens. And whereas my Richter grandparents, they in their cosmopolitan lives, they did not encounter anti-Semitism in the way that we kind of think about when we think about Nazi Germany and this kind of life, whereas my mom's father, Jack Koenig, absolutely did, because it was just a different environment. It was a very kind of rural, very undereducated sort of population, and he was called Christ killer at school, and he was a little bit he was actually in his school years as Hitler was ascending to power, and they had book burnings as public assemblies in the school. So he was constantly just bullied and harassed and beaten by his classmates, and he ended up getting out on a kinder transport, as well as his brother, his younger brother Jules, both got out on kinder transports, and their arc is kind of amazing. They're sort of the Forrest Gumps of my family story, because they get out on kinder transport. Jules, his brother, initially goes to the U.S. already to live with some distant family relations, and then Jack ends up in London waiting for a U.S. visa, working itinerant labor as a teenager, and then comes to the U.S. Both of them end up being enlisted in the U.S. Army as old teenagers, and then go back to Germany, both of them, to fight. And then there's this very complicated, very I would say morally complicated and nuanced story of Jack's. In between, I don't even mention that Jack was incarcerated in Buchenwald, so arrested on Kristallnacht and incarcerated in Dachau. One of my great grandfathers, who's in the book as well, incarcerated in Buchenwald. But my grandfather Jack's story goes from this victim to potential victimizer as a liberating U.S. soldier who goes to settle some scores in his hometown. So that is those are some of the family characters.
I mean, throughout there are all these small tributary stories that show you the vagaries of success in terms of survival. One is that your grandmother, in maybe apocryphal, maybe true, erases what he says about his English ability in order to come to the United States, and says, instead of saying some English, says perfect English, and that secures him a spot in the United States and sort of takes the reins for a half a minute and possibly, sort of puts the train onto a different track in terms of your story.
Yeah, and that is a true story. That's definitely a well-trod family story of my rabbi grandfather, who was just being very modest and is I know German and French, and I studied Greek and Latin in my schooling, and English is related to those languages, and so he has this very meandering response on the telegram to the congregation in Springfield, Missouri. But then my grandmother intercepts this telegram, crosses it out, and says English perfect, and that got them their ticket. But the whole book is each of these stories, each of these people's stories is a bunch of near misses. My mom's father, my grandpa Jack, he just it was they generally didn't even let 17-year-olds on these kinder transports, these child transport vessels out of Germany, but he happened to be working at a nursing home that was supported by HIAS, the Jewish humanitarian organization, which was also organizing these kinder transports, and they just kind of pushed the paperwork to the correct desk to get him out. So each of these stories is close calls and near misses, and yeah.
So each of these stories would be in and of themselves very dramatic and exciting, but they're also now visually different. So talk to us a little bit about how you made each section a little bit visually different and the influences that kind of propelled each one, because it's quite different from the beginning of the book.
Yeah, and sure thing. So each chapter I really looked at as a, kind of a standalone story that then feeds into this larger narrative arc. I am not a trained cartoonist / illustrator. I come from a fine arts education. That's what I teach professionally. And, it wasn't until I got the wild hair up my ass to do this book that I was like, okay, I'm going to be a comics maker. I'm going to be a cartoonist. And so I don't have that skill set that, that cartoonists who spend their whole lives training to make sure that one panel, is, legible from one panel to the next panel, that this character is the same as that character, and that, that it's so like visually readable. I just didn't come in with those skills. So I was like, well, what do I have? I'm trained in a style of art making that's more focused toward expressiveness. So I'm saying, like, what am I trying to express and communicate with each of these standalone chapters? So then I developed different visual languages and visual styles as I am, building this story arc. Sometimes they're based historically. So, for instance, my great grandfather Richard May, who he's one of the first like ancestor testimonies that I illustrate in the book. He was arrested on Kristallnacht and then interned in Buchenwald for a number of months. He was of an older generation, more contemporaneous to German expressionism and those aesthetics, and it happens to be something that I'm personally very visually engaged with. So I was thinking, okay, German expressionism, slightly more painterly aesthetic of art making, and so I was thinking about artists like George Gross and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and Max Beckmann, of course, and so I'm just have these influences in my mind. But other chapters, like the growing up in Tampa chapter, is more kind of like airy and light and almost like humorous in different ways. So I was thinking about the Sunday funnies that I was growing up reading and the comics aesthetic. So that was filtering through my mind. My dad's parents, the Rabbi Carl and Ruth Richter, they told their story so many times. It was very much like a crystallized story, but their telling of it. So it was a much more photographically referenced chapter. Their chapters, like I have like so much documentation of them. So it kind of starts more from photographic collage. And so again, each of those things is still filtered through my artistic lens and my hand, but it's, they each have kind of like a different influence or starting point visually.
This is obviously a third generation memoir and investigation. The memoir that people will be most associate with it is Maus, but that's a second generation memoir. I'm curious how you see the difference between the two.
Yeah, and Maus, the mouse in the room is that, that Spiegelman's work is absolutely a huge influence on myself personally on this project. It was actually, I discovered Maus as like probably like maybe an 11-year-old kid in my mom's father, my grandpa Jack's, like immense, like, Holocaust library. He was not like a comics reader, but Maus was already something in the zeitgeist, and especially in that conversation was an important literary work. So it was like probably the first non-Marvel and DC comic that I read, at all. And it was definitely before, like, he basically was the progenitor of the graphic literature boom, a major force there. So he's an absolute absolute influence there. And I looked at, his work and some other graphic memoirists, especially, as kind of like guiding lights. So in addition to Art Spiegelman, Miriam Catton, who wrote 2 amazing graphic memoirs. I can't say one is better than the other, but one called We Are on Our Own, about her and her as a child and her mother's experience in Hungary, Nazi-occupied Hungary, hiding and evading the Nazi authorities there, as well as her follow-up kind of like adult, recollections and coming to terms, called Letting It Go, which is also an amazing book as well. But there's I have a whole bibliography in the book where I talk about all the influences, really just my reading list while I was preparing for this book, and there's a very, very rich history of specific Holocaust memoir. But to your question about what's the difference between third generation and second generation, or survivor generation, is just simply the perspective that comes with time. So Spiegelman wrote his about his father, who was a survivor of Auschwitz in particular, and he grew up with his father is a very kind of imposing figure in his life, and larger than life in his world. And with hindsight, everything you kind of like can see a little bit more clearly, possibly, but it really has to do more with, I think, the political climate that we live in right now. One that I don't think my parents could have, or my grandparents for that matter, could have anticipated, 30 years ago or 40 years ago when Spiegelman wrote Mouse. So we're really living in very different times, which echo so much of the past that this book revolves around, that it's really worth a deeper investigation of where are we right now.
I think that's quite evocative, and I think we should get into that. But there's the subtitle of the book is about trauma and inheritance, and you spend a fair amount of time looking at this idea of epigenetics and the way which we carry trauma. And I actually want you to think about it in two different ways. One is how we carry it in our own person, those of us who grew up with this as our history and our families, and who have these. I mean, I have sort of these VHS tapes from my childhood where everyone has an accent, and now no one. It changes over time. They're all coming from the war, but also you do something else, which is that you try to walk in these spaces as well, and you look to see how the land carries or doesn't carry the mark of that trauma. And I want you to look a little bit at that and how you decided to do that and how that helped the creation of the book.
Yeah, so just epigenetics in general, the idea that trauma can actually be passed down through generations. I think the actual science of it, and I'm not a scientist, there's a lot of fuzzy science at play when people, talk about this thing that's like, that literally I'm like inheriting my grandparents' experiences or something like that in a real way. And I think about it more like, culturally there's for sure an inheritance there. I mean, it's undoubtedly that, that my grandparents passed on certain values and certain fears and certain experiences, through the generations in that cultural sense. But it's really the main inheritance that I'm thinking about when I talk about that in the title of the book is the inheritance of these stories. So it's these stories, my grandparents, they wanted them to be told. Some survivors of traumas are very guarded about these experiences, like my grandpa Jack was for the majority of his adult life. But by the end of their lives, my family all told these stories in a way they wanted it to be recorded. So it's my way of honoring that intention of that legacy. So I've inherited these stories. So whether in an ideal scenario I would want to be the person who carries those stories or carries that weight, it's in a certain way it's not up to me anymore. It's like it's kind of taken me on this journey.
But I think you don't just transcribe the story, right? The stories exist as transcript. What you do is you palpate them, you investigate them. I thought about this a lot when I was working on my book, which is that the stories, when they're told again and again, become very smooth, and you don't ask questions of them. What you do is you ask questions of those stories, and then you look and you examine your own response and how it has informed you going forward.
Yeah, and so, it's... so much of this book is not just about telling these stories, but about analyzing and just thinking about what is the nature of memory itself. Like, what do we remember? How do we remember? And why do we remember? And for each of the characters in my book, for each of my family characters, there's different reasons for that. Some of it is literally just to keep that story alive and make sure that somebody knows what happened in this time in this part of the world. But other times it's almost like there's like a therapeutic context to telling a story over and over again. When you crystallize certain details about an experience, I think it doesn't take the trauma away, but it maybe makes it slightly easier to live with or digest. And I think a good example would be my grandpa Jack. So the child survivor got on the Kindertransport, comes back as a U.S. soldier, and does some stuff that he doesn't fully ever tell anyone in the family about at home, but alludes to this kind of extrajudicial, justice that he took going back to his hometown on furlough after the war was won. And, he always talked about his like going to like settle some scores, and he never, he never got into details, but it was always something that, we could imagine and have in our minds. And I'm sure like in his, no matter what actually happened, there was like some version of it in his mind that kind of like that like revenge fantasy that kept him going maybe. And that's something that, I found, always a little bit kind of titillating to myself, that revenge fantasy idea, this idea that, going back and, taking justice. But I had to analyze in the book as well, like what does that say about me that I kind of like am titillated by those ideas, and that's by the idea of him going and like terrorizing his local community in Germany.
Yeah, I'm gonna pause on that one for a minute. But, although I think it is really provocative. I think that this question is extremely provocative, but so is the title of the book itself. And I actually, I want to make sure we get to the title. So tell us a little bit about the title. I know that actually stands alone as an essay that you had published with Tablet originally. I don't know if it's expanded for the book.
It's just altered in small
Slightly.
ways, but it's like mostly what someone was saying.
Tell us a little bit, but the title is provocative, purposefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, like using like using the term "never again," kind of gets one's attention. It's intentionally meant to be provocative. Never again will I visit Auschwitz. It's that original essay, which is part of the book, a chapter in the book, was about my experience in, I believe it was 2019, where my wife Erin and I went to the Auschwitz-Birkenau memorial to kind of just to go have an experience there. I was already working on some ideas for this book, Tree of Life. Synagogue Massacre had already happened. Kind of the impetus for this book was already in my mind. And I went, for the context, I had numerous relatives who were murdered in Auschwitz, including my mother's grandmother, Rudolfina Honig. And so I wanted to go and kind of like, have like almost like a, communing with this very loaded place. And I didn't get to have that experience because of both the incredible kind of disorganization of the place, also the touristic vibes of the place. It's really run as kind of like a tourist destination, like in some very clear ways. And also, we just did like the standard tour there, and that the Polish state government, which runs it, puts on the English language tour, and it was almost like primarily centered on non-Jewish Polish suffering at Auschwitz, which I was shocked by. I mean, which is of course like, many Poles were, were oppressed and murdered in Auschwitz, but proportionally, not in any comparative way to the European Jews and Polish Jews in particular there. So it was just like a real eye-opening experience. It was like, almost as the Tree of Life massacre kind of like pulled the wool over my eyes as an American Jew. Going to Auschwitz kind of, again, pulled the veil about what this other experience was. It was like seeing into an alternate reality of, this is like, it's just like an experience that I just had not anticipated seeing. So that's what the impetus of it was. And, that feeling of kind of like disorientation and alienation, is really what the rest of the book expanded from, which is why I decided to keep the title there from that initial essay in Tablet. And then the subtitle, graphic family memoir, I want to make sure we're clear, this is not a graphic novel, of trauma and inheritance, both what we talked about, epigenetics, or this literal inheritance of trauma, but also in a later chapter called Tikkun Olameter, which is I make up this pretend machine about that, a pretend machine that gauges your families or your personal, like world healing in the Tikkun Olam sense. It's like a tongue-in-cheek thing. But I do talk about, like how can I, or how can other people whose families have experienced things like this, how can we try to transmute this into something that's positive and productive, in the world healing sense. So, so I think about, like my literal inheritance, like my, grandparents, my Holocaust survivor grandparents, both received German restitution checks from the German government until the day they die. It wasn't like anything substantial. It was like a small amount of money, but it certainly, helped them accumulate wealth in a way that, they were able to, I was able to inherit some amount of money that, from there. So I was thinking, like in that book, how can we, use the idea of literal inheritance as a, if not a metaphor, as a, conversation starter for people who did not have, access to, other traumatized groups who did not have access to that kind of, say, financial or otherwise,
reparations.
Reparations, exactly.
The book, and I want to get to questions, the book does wrap up at a pretty dramatic moment in American history with COVID, January 6th, and then you yourself personally becoming a father twice over. And I want to know, how do you feel this book, how did this come together for you at a moment of becoming a parent, first of all, and at a very dramatic moment in American history?
Yeah. So when I pitched the book to to Fantagraphics, who ultimately published it, I basically had like a 3/4 written outline. I had a 3/4 written script for it, and I knew that there was going to be a final section that was going to be based in current experience. Like I was going to take these trips to Germany. I took multiple trips, a couple trips to Germany and to Poland to kind of like walk in the footsteps of my family members, but also. I believe when I had sold the book to Fantagraphics, I already knew that my wife Erin was pregnant with our first daughter, and so, I always knew that it was going to be part of the narrative, and really thinking about how the legacy of these stories, like the number one audience that I wrote this for was my kids. And I wanted them to have this information, to have these stories, if not this be like the definitive version of the stories. It's certainly, as Sarah mentioned before, it's definitely, through my editorial and illustrative kind of intervention. So, they can always access the original documents themselves, just as I had, but it's a starting point. And they can at least see, how I saw or interpreted, these stories.
And I should say the book is deeply, deeply researched. It's not reliant on one single set of testimonies. And there's a moment at the beginning of the book where you're almost quite literally drowning in research, and everybody starts to send you everything they've collected.
I'm looking at you, Uncle Benson.
I want to give us time. I have more questions, but let me open it up and see. Do we have any questions in the audience? Just looking at the time. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much to both of you for being here today. My name is Nathan Weissler, and I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington, D.C. area. My question is, and also I'm hoping ultimately to teach Holocaust history and Jewish history, and my question is, I have a late great uncle who was one of the American liberators of Dachau, and he played a central role in reuniting a Jewish family after the war. One of the members of the family. One of the members of the family was hiding in a monastery, and that's how my great uncle met him inside the monastery when he was among a group of soldiers who was taking a shower there. But anyway, it's a great story. One thing I would say I took away from this story is that these experiences don't just impact. These formative and life-changing experiences don't only impact that generation, the generation who experienced it, but generations down the line, even people who never met the primary actors involved. And this leads me to the question I was going to ask. What would you say are some of the most important ways in which your family's Holocaust experiences has impacted all the generations, regardless of what point in time?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. And, I would say the best example that I can cite would be my father's parents, my Rabbi Carl Richter and Ruth Richter, who were, both community leaders. So they not only told their experiences throughout the Midwest, where they led a number of small congregations throughout their professional lives, but they also led and taught by example. Their lives, were not just this kind of like refugee rabbi novelty act that they, toured around, different Elks Lodges and, and JCCs, but in the Midwest, but they really internalized their experiences in a way that they were able to, practice what they preach, for lack of a different pun there. But they, but also like my mom's father, Jack Koenig, he was he was a middle school shop teacher, and he retired on a, shop teacher's pension. And he absolutely, even though he had his own issues, he had a lot of anger problems and kind of like processing his traumas. He absolutely, he impacted generations of young students who, like, interesting anecdote. I lived in Asheville, North Carolina for a couple of years, as did my sister for a number of years before me. We both happened to have had the same exact landlord in the same house in Asheville, and he was from New Jersey. And he found out at some point, like, much later on in our relationship, he's like, wait, your grandfather was Jack Koenig? And like, he's like, that was my middle school shop teacher. So, it's like, these things like, again, even if it's not like, he's not specifically, he did go and like lecture at, schools in the suburban New Jersey area about his experience. But again, he taught by example. And I think that all survivors of these, traumas, they internalize what's happened to them, and then they, in the best case, they've externalized it, to the audiences and the people that they have to, to have an impact with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I wasn't supposed to ask any other questions. Hi, Elizabeth.
I can't wait to read the book. I'm curious about the echoes between this moment that we're living in and, reading your family stories, especially in Germany. What kind of surprised you in those echoes, and what like actions do you think we should consider given those echoes?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you, Elizabeth. So, I consider myself, a student of history, and I've always been interested in, world history, and especially in World War II and Holocaust history, because it's such a, specific family thing, in my experience. But, it really wasn't until I was researching for this book and it's really reading into what the, the Munich Putsch was, for instance, in a clear way that, there's a page in the book where I'm, where January 6th is happening, and I'm literally visually confused between what's unfolding in front of me and what I knew happened in that what seemed like such a far away and distant past. And it's the rhetoric, of course, it's the rhetoric that we see from some of our politicians right now. Even ones that are courting Jewish votes, in certain ways, that that the rhetoric itself is echoing rhetoric of Hitler and the Nazi Party, and it's just it's very disquieting. And I know I'm definitely not the only one in this room who has felt some of these feelings. And of course, over the last 8 years, we've all had an opportunity to experience and feel these things. But it's just understanding how much of a razor's edge that we're always balancing on, despite what we might think is our perceived security or privilege based on the situation that we're born into, or that we perceive ourselves being in. And it's just I think like an ultimate goal of this project too, not just telling these stories, but trying to raise general levels of empathy. But for all people's experiences, not just empathy for my family and what they went through, but just this idea that there's human experience, that all people are feeling emotional creatures, and that if we can all just be, if we can all just kind of like turn a little bit more toward the other and try to embrace, other cultures, other people, and kind of like, understand that we're all in this together, that maybe there's be some better outcomes in the world as a result.
Other questions? I wonder a little bit, though, about overly creating comparisons and creating a new set of tools. I mean, part of the problem is you want to learn from the past and not recreate it, but at the same time, you have to learn from the moment you're in. What do you think that you picked up about what was happening for them that you felt was different?
So, like, what was different about that historical moment versus?
Yeah, I think I worry
right
a
now?
lot. I mean, look, I think that we absolutely need to be paying attention to the past, and I'm obsessed with reading these memoirs. And I think each story allows us to a deeper understanding. But what do you feel? I mean, how do you feel? Do you find any comfort in seeing a difference between the past and the present?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not productive to, point to certain politicians and being like, you're a literal Nazi, because they're not literal Nazis, right? I mean, there are neo-Nazis in the world for sure, but, they don't come from Germany, the Nazi party. They're in their own, configuration of that. But it's definitely not productive to be like, I am now a Jew living in pre-war Nazi Germany, and I got to watch out. I think what can be productive is to look at that actual history and that actual past and say, how can this help influence a path forward for the societal ills that we're seeing right now? And yeah, it's definitely not productive to make direct comparisons in a lot of ways. I mean, in that Tikkun Olam chapter, I talk specifically about my grandparents' German reparations in relation to African-American reparations in the U.S. And it's definitely, I try to make very clear that I'm not saying that these are two, identical or even similar experiences, because they're both, based on their unique horrors of their particular times and places and cultures. But to be able to draw comparisons and say, okay, I see a relationship between the treatment of, my family, in Nazi Germany, as I do see the treatment of enslaved African Americans and African Americans under Jim Crow in this country. They're by being able to see those comparisons, I think that something productive can come of that, because that's the empathy part of it. But also, there's a literal pathway too. It's because the German government was ironically forced in a large part by the occupying U.S. forces to create the reparations programs for the German Jews. But there is an actual, it would in immediately post-war Germany, most saw it as impossible to do something like that, to create financial restitutions for the losses there. But the fact that there is a blueprint, so that's also I think a productive way to think about how can we tikkun olam our current situation for people outside of my specific cultural purview.
Did you think a bit about safe havens? I mean, your specific immediate family finds safe haven, but within those stories, one of the things I thought about a lot while constructing mine, which is that survival didn't equal happiness, because so much guilt was carried by those who got out but weren't able to throw the lifeboat back over, and how the doors closed. And the sort of vagaries of that moment and seeing a safe haven and thinking about that now.
Yeah, I mean, well, when we're talking about safe haven and what's some things happening in the geopolitically right now. I mean, it's certainly that's where I think that that extra life raft of empathy could be very helpful. But something I think about a lot in relation to this story is both survivors' guilt that my family, carried with them after surviving, which is, what you're talking about, doesn't equate happiness. Survival is not necessarily happiness. You carry that guilt that it was not, that you survived, yet other people didn't in your family, in your community. Why me? But there's also the, survivor's bias that comes with that situation too, that, it's like, it's like, oh, well, it's just my grandparents were especially optimistic or something like that. And it's like, well, yeah, like my dad's parents at least were, very optimistically thinking people, and that probably did help them, survive. But that certainly it's like they survived by providence. They survived because of all those little, happenstances that got them to where they ultimately, lived.
and how they embrace life after. I think we have one more question.
Hey, Kristen.
Hi.
Stacking it with friends here.
So I'm curious, obviously your visual art and the written word are two big components of the book, but it also seems like humor is a huge component of the book. And I wanted to sort of hear from you, is that related to the trauma piece? Is it related to the inheritance? Is it about sort of the safe harbor or, the kind of hope that you might have for the world? And so I was just hoping you could draw out a little bit for us sort of where the humor kind of fits in with everything.
Yeah, excellent question. And it's the short answer is it's a little bit of all of those things. So there's the processing of trauma piece of it. It's like I certainly, will crack jokes about everything, and there are even some things that I decide to leave on the cutting room floor of this book because maybe they're a little bit too a little bit too edgy in these contexts. So processing trauma with humor I think is very, very important. Like the panel of me and my dad waiting for the elevator, I make the Schindler's List joke. I mean, it's inappropriate in any other context, but to inheritors of that of that trauma to crack those jokes. But the humor, also think about the inheritance, the cultural inheritance. We think about Jewish humor. It's like this idea that what I've kind of come to understand as what we call Jewish humor is just laughing at forces of oppression. It's just looking at an impossible situation and finding humor in there. There was in my Grandpa Jack's chapter, one of the chapters of his where he's interned in Dachau, and he talks about these imprisoned Jewish Viennese cabaret performers who just put on these lighthearted musicals in the camp about their falling in love and these kind of things, which were of course what we call gallows humor, but it was a way for them to get through, and they entertained the other interned people there, and but also the relief of it, like you said, safe haven too. It's I can crack these jokes because my family made it to the safety of America in this case. So it's all of those things. It's part of a relief in a way. So it's all of those things. But humor is a very important tool in this book, and personally.
I think that's sorry.
Oh, and Aunt Dina. One last. Do we have room for one time for one last?
No, it's okay. I don't have a question.
She's just trying to close this thing out.
Hi, Ari.
Hi, Dina.
I just wanted to know, it's a huge project, which you worked for years. So on
5 years.
one level, it's probably a little bit of a relief that it's behind you on one level. But on another level, I'm thinking, is that process of working through your, through that book and through the way you did it, is it something that you think is teachable?
Yeah, I'm still working through the book. It's I thought it would exercise my demons, but it's helped visualize them. It's helped me visualize them, put a name to it, put a just put it in a little box for later. But it's still there, and I think I'll spend the rest of my life working through this. And this is as a third generation inheritor of these stories. But that just shows how they filter through, and I hope that the book is helpful to other other survivors and generational, third generation survivors and further down the line of the Holocaust, but also just of any historical traumas. Because again, there's the general human empathy part of this that, hoping that the story will speak to, almost anyone's experiences and kind of make the world a little bit smaller than it felt before.
I'm wondering, because you're a teacher and because you're a professor, do you see it as something you'll bring to the classroom? The process.
I hope to teach some comics classes, graphic novels classes in the coming years and semesters. But I haven't quite figured out how that will work yet.
Okay,
but
thanks.
Thank you very much.
I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you, Ari
Thank you,
and
Sarah.
Sarah.
And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.